What is going on, guys? It's Meui here, back with another First Descendant video. And for this video, I'm going to be going over my updated bunny build. And this is going to be coming in 3 different variations or 3 different types of content to kind of hyper optimize what you're doing. For those of you that watched my bunny guide from about 5 weeks ago, that build is still very relevant and very strong. There is a couple adjustments that I made to that one specifically. Now, the changes to that build is actually only going to require 1 single catalyst for this new updated build. So if you are using that, you're not going to have to use too many catalysts if you want to switch over to this. And like I said, I did mention 3 variations. One of those variations will also require an additional catalyst. However, we do have that new system that lets us recatalyze different slots for different presets. So in total, if you want to be able to use all 3 of these setups, it's going to take you a total of 2 catalysts if you are using my previous build. Now, if you're not using that previous build or you're new here, well, first of all, welcome to the channel. And secondly, I hope you all enjoy this build video. Anyways, let's not waste any more time and get right into this. So this first build here is based around completely maximizing damage. It is very similar to my original build with one small change that I will talk about as I go through the mods here. Now, this is the highest damage of the 3 setups. However, depending on what you're doing, the other setups can be much better. So I'll talk about the purpose for each setup and when you want to use each setup. So for this high damage setup, you're typically going to want to use this versus stronger enemies in close proximity, or doing a mission where the enemies are pretty close together and there's not huge gaps. So some examples of that would be a Spec Ops defense mission, a Spec Ops hypermining mission, or a certain open world mission where you're looping around and you're constantly killing enemies. And of course, this would be the setup that you would use against Colossi as well, but I will show you some swaps that you'll want to make if you are using it for that purpose. For our mods, we're going to be using high voltage. This is exclusive to Ultimate Bunny, but it is absolutely her best mod in the game right now. Actually, all the builds are going to be based on high voltage, so just something to keep in mind. Now, for our base damage mods, we're going to be taking Electric Specialist and Singular Specialist. If you are using my previous build, that is going to require you to recatalyze this from the X, which I originally had Skill Simplification. Now, Skill Simplification did give overall more damage per zap by a pretty noticeable amount. However, that 25 extra mana did end up impacting pretty heavily how much you can actually sprint throughout the different content in the game. And I found that making this swap with that extra uptime on the sprint just feels better in general, but will also let you sustain damage over time more consistently. So I did opt to make that swap and get that 25% mana back in exchange for a little bit of a damage loss per zap. So that is the only real major change in terms of the original build to this one. Now, these can change depending on what your reactor looks like. So you may run focus on electric here and then focus on singular here for the cooldown. And the reason you may want that cooldown is because if you look at our ability here, after applying the high voltage mod, we have a cooldown on our 3, which is what this build is based around, called lightning emission. We have 22-second cooldown with a duration of 20 seconds. We want to close that gap so that we have 100% uptime. So there is a couple ways to do this. One would be focus on electric and focus on singular. That will give us that 100% uptime. But another option that you can actually do is to add duration onto your reactor. If you get a gold roll of that, you're actually going to have 100% uptime. And the reason that this can be better is because you are not using your 3 as much, which means you are maintaining max electric more often because it's lasting 2 seconds longer now. So it actually ends up being a larger damage output, in my opinion. I like having duration on the reactor itself, and it also carries over to all 3 builds. So essentially, you could do the 2 focus mods and then 2 damage mods on your reactor, or you can have the 2 specialist mods, have the duration on your reactor, and then have another damage roll on your reactor. Either of those options is very good. And like I said, for this particular setup, we are maxing out the damage as much as possible. So we're going to be throwing in the 4 crit mods, which ends up giving us about a 90 to 100% damage bonus on top of the base mods. So we're taking Skill Insight, Skill Concentration, Emergency Measures, and Front Lines. That's going to give us a lot of crit chance and a lot of crit damage. Now, you may be wondering, why are we stacking crit? Bunny only has 10% base crit hit chance. Well, again, like I said, stacking all of these together gives her a massive damage bonus, and there's nowhere else we can really get much more damage on this character. So this is actually a very good option and will make clears a lot faster. Now, for the rest of the mods, we are going to be taking skill expansion, as well as maximize range. We want to make sure to max out the range on this ability, which is 300% max expandable range, which means we need about 200% extra on our mods. Now you can see that we're not quite maxed out. The max would be 27 meters and we're at 25.8, but we're basically there. If this really bugs you, what you can do is add range onto your reactor, but you're going to be losing damage that way. So just something to think about. I've found that this is plenty of range and I haven't had any issues with it whatsoever. And we'll also be taking increased HP. Now Buddy is mainly used for farming, as most of you know. Increased HP is going to give us plenty of tankiness if you follow along with the components I show you. The reason for this is because components are what are giving you most of your survivability. So we just want to make sure we have at least the increased HP mod. This is going to give us plenty of survivability to do all the farming content in the game here, minus invasions, which I do have a separate setup for. So make sure you at least have increased HP here. And then for this mod, we're going to be taking MP collector to help us keep the uptime on our sprint here, because we want to be able to sprint as much as possible. This is going to make it so we can move faster through whatever content we're doing, but also it makes our lightning emission proc more often. This procs every 7 meters that you move. So being able to sprint constantly is going to make that proc more, which leads to more damage overall. So you definitely, even though this is the high damage variation for kind of those smaller missions with close proximity enemies, you still want something that's helping you to restore your mana on your dash. So at a base, we're going to be taking MP collector. And the last mod here, this is a flex to whatever you prefer. However, I am using mid-air maneuvering. I'm going to talk about that kind of in the flex options that I'm about to get into, because this is very good for actually doing bosses, but it's just good in general as well. So with that, let's get into the flex options for this build, which should be pretty familiar to you again if you watch the original guide. Now if you are using Bunny for actually doing Colossus bosses, this is the base setup that you're going to want to use, but there is a couple changes that you will want to make here. One is going to be changing MP collector here to dangerous ambush. That is going to give you more damage to bosses overall when they are not targeting you, which is actually more than you think. Sometimes even in solo instances, the boss is not always targeting you and you actually get extra damage from this. And when you immobilize the boss, which means that they go down, you get a large boost that is now 50% extra skill power. And skill power is the main stat we want to take here, because if you look at the damage modifier on lightning emission, it is currently at 230%, but we're actually going to be swapping out maximize range, so it will be at 250%. And around the 190% range is when you want to start stacking skill power rather than skill power modifier. I have a video explaining that stuff if you are interested, but essentially you want to start stacking skill power. So dangerous ambush is going to be your best option for bosses. And you can actually use this mod as well if you're doing spec ops and stuff. Now you are going to have to constantly be running over mana packs and stuff like that, but if that's something you don't mind, then this is a good option to get out more damage. But the uptime on your dash is generally going to be much less than if you run MP collector, so that's up to you. But again, for bosses, make sure you're running dangerous ambush. And the other change you're going to want to make for bossing is changing this maximize range here to spear and shield. This is going to give you some extra survivability against bosses, as well as some more of that skill power or extra damage. And we can actually afford to lose some range when we are fighting bosses, because you can generally be in close proximity to them. And if I save this here, you are still going to be having 17.3 meters range, which is plenty versus bosses. As long as you are positioning yourself correctly, then this is a very good swap that I would definitely recommend. I always swap to this when I'm doing bosses with Bunny and never really have an issue with range. And then again, this is a flex option. Now for most content on Bunny, I would recommend this because it gives you a lot of damage and it will proc your lightning emission a lot when you grapple in the air and kind of swing in a circle. It makes it actually proc a ton of times. However, another good choice here that I like using a lot with Bunny is long distance maneuvering. This will let you grapple boss parts from very far away, so shoulders and stuff like that. When they become yellow, you can grapple them, and this helps a lot with that. And this also helps a lot with traversing different dungeons and missions and stuff, because you get 2 charges, whereas with mid-air maneuvering you only get 1 charge, but the charges do take a little bit longer on this to refresh. So I would probably stick to one of those 2 options, but both are great. And then finally, for our flex options, depending on your reactor, you can use focus on singular and focus on electric here for that 100% uptime. That is your personal choice, but I'm going with duration on the reactor so that I have more uptime on 100% electricity, and I can use singular specialist and electric specialist. But again, that is a flex option for you if you prefer that. And let's quickly get into the reactor here, as well as the components. So for my reactor, I'm going to be taking, like I said, the duration. Now the second role roll, can be whatever damage stat you really want. This is just the reactor that I have right now, but skill crit chance would be good. Skill crit hit damage is good. Or if you get electric boost or singular boost, those are also very good. Those are essentially just more flat skill power. So if you had like 0.084 times for electric skill power boost ratio or modifier, however it says it in the substats, that basically just means 8.4% more electric skill power. Now, if you are using focus on electricity and focus on singular, then you can do 2 damage rolls on this. So again, same exact pool of damage rolls, but you would do 2 of them. So you could do crit hit chance and damage, singular and electric boost, crit hit chance and electric boost. Now for your component set here, I typically like to go with the Slayer set for this particular setup, because the whole idea around this is that we are killing enemies very frequently with very little downtime, which means our MP collector is going to be proccing very often, which in turn lets us benefit from the Slayer set. Even though it does have additional skill costs, which is going to make us drain our mana faster, we get a lot more damage out of this. So I do usually take the Slayer set for this setup. It's also very nice for bosses as well. So going through each piece, for your auxiliary power, you are going to want max HP and then ideally MP recovery out of combat. Now this role is not quite as important as you think, because there's very little downtime on Bunny where you're actually out of combat, especially with this setup, because again, it's meant for kind of that close proximity, constantly killing enemies and spec ops and stuff like that. So you won't get a ton of value out of this. So another good option on this is taking fire resistance. And the reason for that is because those pesky barrels that blow up on you all the time and set you on fire, it can actually help with that. So that is not a bad option to take here on your auxiliary power, as opposed to MP recovery out of combat. For your Slayer sensor, you're going to want as much max mana as possible, as well as much MP recovery in combat as possible. This is going to be your most important component piece, so you want to try to get as high rolls as possible on that, and they are both very important rolls. For your Slayer memory, you're going to want defense at the very minimum. The other role you're going to want to look for is MP recovery modifier. This is going to affect your passive regen by a little bit. It's not a lot, but it will still help, and it will also make those mana kits that mobs drop on the ground actually restore more mana for you. So that is a very good role as well. So you want to try to get the defense with the MP recovery modifier. And on your processor, this is probably the least important part, but you want to try to get as much max shield as possible. And the other role you're going to want to look for is shield recovery modifier. That basically just means your shield will regen a little bit quicker, but that is the completely least important role of any of the roles, so don't worry about that one too much. I have toxin resistance here, which can help in some cases when you're running through like those toxic pools and certain missions and stuff. So it's not super important, but you definitely want to try to at least get the max shield roll on this. All right, guys, and that is going to do it for the damage setup, and that is again basically maximizing our damage and having kind of a very little downtime between mobs. Now for this next setup, it's going to be optimized around still maintaining a lot of that damage, but also having some other utility to let us sprint more often. So in dungeons in this game, there is a lot of downtime between actual mobs where you'll be sprinting a lot, and you want to try to hyper optimize that as much as possible. Not only because it feels better to use, but it will get you through dungeons more quickly and more consistently. So I've gone ahead and swapped the damage setup back to its base mods, because I want you to be able to see the changes going from this to the dungeon setup, and there isn't very many. So we'll go ahead and go to the dungeon setup here, and you'll see it. The only real change to the base mods themselves is going to be right here. Now the cool part about this swap here is you actually do not have to recatalyze this. This is a polarity that came with Bunny herself, so you can come down to this thing right here and set the polarity to Malachite, and you're good to go. You don't need to recatalyze this slot. If you are using my old build, you can simply swap it, and now you have maximized conservation. Now what this is doing is simply giving us much more uptime on our sprint itself. You can see it now costs us 19.9 mana when sprinting, instead of, if we look over here, 28.8, and this gives us a ton more uptime, and also gives us more time to actually proc our MP collector to get mana back. So this helps us fill those gaps between the mobs in dungeons where you're kind of killing mobs and then you're running to the next room and killing mobs and running to the next room. This will make sure you have a lot less downtime and you're not getting stuck as much with no mana, so that you can't actually sprint, and it will actually just make your clear speeds faster in general, and in my opinion feels better to use. So we changed from front lines here to maximize conservation. So we did drop a little bit of damage, but now we have a lot more uptime on our sprint, which also means that we are going to be sprinting more often and have more uptime on that. And remember, when you are sprinting, your 3 is going to be proccing more often, which means you're still going to be doing more damage when you are sprinting. That is actually the only change that you need to make for the dungeon setup. Very easy to make, and again, no catalyst required whatsoever for that. Now you may think, well, this is getting rid of a 20 skill modifier and this is getting rid of 20 skill modifier. Isn't that going to cut our damage down a lot? The answer is no. It's really not going to affect your your damage very much. And I've actually tested this up against the damage setup and ran through several different dungeons, and the results I came up with is in the shorter dungeons they came out about the same, but this was consistently a little bit faster, at least by a couple seconds in every single dungeon. And in the longer dungeons such as Biolab, this came out way ahead in terms of clear times. I was getting results anywhere from 20% to 30% shorter clear times with this build in the longer dungeons over with this build here. So again, you do want to try to optimize that sprinting so that you have it constantly and can run through the dungeon quickly. Now, I'm not going to really get into flex options because it's going to be the same exact deal as the damage setup. However, I would not use this for bossing. I would go with the damage setup for bossing and just use that and use the swaps that I showed you. But I will mention one small flex option that you can make here. Now, I do like MP Collector, but the actual uptime of it is not going to be as high in a dungeon as, say, a Spec Ops mission where you're killing a lot more frequently. So a valid swap here will be from MP Collector to Energy Collection. And essentially what this does is makes your passive mana regen a little bit higher. Again, it's not going to be very noticeable, but it does help some. But on top of that, again, it makes the mana packs that drop from enemies also restore more mana. So when you're going through a dungeon, this can be very helpful. Now, one important thing about this is that mobs do not always drop mana packs, so there is RNG to this. Similarly to obviously the MP Collector, there is still RNG involved, but there's less RNG. However, you're going to have to consciously be running over those mana packs and making sure you're collecting them to keep your mana up, but this is an okay swap if you prefer this. So I would try both out and see which one you like. From my testing personally, they came out about the same, so I just went with what I'm used to, which is the MP Collector. But again, this is a good swap if you prefer that. For your Reactor, the same exact rules apply to this build as the previous build, so I'm not going to go over it again. You can do the same thing with your Reactor here. For the components, there is actually two valid options. One is going to be the Slayer set, which I went over previously, but the other one is actually if you want to use the Supernova set. Now, this does look a little bit squishier, obviously because my health went down some, but you do get more defense, so they end up being pretty similar in terms of tankiness. Now, I did test this against the Slayer set in multiple runs through multiple different types of dungeons, and essentially the result I came up with from my test is that they are almost identical. And when I mean identical, I mean like within 5 seconds of each other in terms of clear times. So if you do want to use the Supernova set, it's actually also very strong on Bunny. Now, the main reason this set is able to keep up with the Slayer set is going to be from the passive, which is where it basically calls lightning down and strikes the enemy on a 2-second cooldown. Now, something important with this passive is that it actually procs off of your electrocution. So every time you hit something with lightning emission, it triggers electrocution, which deals damage every second for 3 seconds, as you can see at the bottom here. And electrocution will actually proc that lightning bolt. So if you run through a bunch of enemies and say 1 or 2 of them doesn't die in one hit, you'll actually get that lightning proc on one, and then if that one dies, the electrocution will be ticking on the other one, and then the lightning bolt will proc on the other one and also hit that one. So it ends up getting a ton of procs as you run through enemies and ends up doing a lot of damage, especially to bosses, because it's just going to keep procking on bosses at the end of dungeons and striking them with lightning. So this actually does end up being very similar damage output to the Slayer set, but the thing I like a lot more about this one is that it doesn't have that extra skill cost, so it lets you sprint more, and that does help make up the time in terms of these being very identical, because as far as the damage output, this will be a little bit lower, but you have more sprint uptime overall, and they end up equaling out pretty much. So I actually have been using this more lately than Slayer set when I'm doing dungeons. It just feels better because you can run forever pretty much. And as for the sub rolls on this, I'm not going to go through them. It's exactly the same as the Slayer set. All right, so again, that is our dungeon setup. So this is what you're going to want to use when you're going through dungeons, aka infiltrations. This will get you the best clear times the most consistently and just feels the best to use in my opinion. And now we're going to get into the last setup, which is a setup based around the invasions. Now, invasions are the new content with season 1, and essentially they are the dungeons but with some puzzles in them, and the enemies hit harder. Also, another thing that's important with the invasions is that the bosses at the end, a lot of them have homing missiles and stuff, which is really annoying. Not a big fan of that, but the missiles basically will chase you around and do a ton of damage, so you actually need to be pretty durable for these. But on top of that, you also need a good amount of damage so that you can one phase the boss, because in the boss room you have to perform the puzzle once and then break their shield, and then you have a certain amount of time to kill them before you have to do it again. You want to definitely be able to kill them within that time frame so you don't have to do it again. So this build takes that into account so that you have enough damage to be able to one phase the boss, as long as you have a decent weapon as well, which I hope you do if you're going into these invasions. So let's get into that setup now, and you'll see a couple differences when I click over here. I'm not going to go over over the base mods that have not changed because again, they serve the same purpose, but I am going to go over the changes we made here. Now, from our previous build, we had maximized conservation. We are now using strong mentality. That is going to give us some damage back. And because the invasions require a lot less movement between rooms and just in general, we can get away with our sprint costing more, but the strong mentality still helps us to sprint more often without that damage loss that we're getting from the maximized conservation. Now, another change I've made is going from maximize range here to amplification control. Now, we do lose a little range here, so we're now at 22 meters as opposed to 25.8 meters. But in these invasions, the enemies are pretty close together and spawn in packs, and you're going to be in one room for a long amount of time. So I've found that you don't need as much range because you're not just running through one room to the next room. You're running more so from pack to pack. So this ends up working just fine. And again, it gives us another 20% of our skill power modifier back. So we're getting some of that damage back as well, and also increases our shield, which, you know, shield isn't that great, but it is what it is. And the last mod we're going to be changing here is we go from emergency measures. So we're dropping one additional crit mod. We are going from 4 here to 3 here, and now we are down to 2, and we are replacing it with HP amplification. Again, we want to be more durable in these invasion missions because, like I said, enemies just hit harder. There's homing missiles, things like that. So you want to be tankier, and we offset that max shield loss again with the amplification control. Now, for the 2 crit mods, you're definitely going to want to keep the blue ones. These are the best bang for your buck, so I would definitely keep the blue crit mods for the additional damage here. As far as flex option goes, there's a couple different ones here that you can use. The first being, again, if you just want to swap in the maximize range, or if you want to swap in the maximize conservation, that is fine. But again, I found that they are not necessary in invasions, and you will lose some damage as well. I like keeping the damage because it does help in that final boss phase, especially where you need to kill them in a certain amount of time. And I just really haven't found the need for additional skill cost reduction or additional range for this particular build. And another swap you can make is energy collection. However, I do like MP collector more in invasions because mobs are constantly spawning, so there isn't a whole lot of downtime between actually killing packs of mobs. But again, energy collection is also a good choice here. As for HP amplification, one change you can make here is to swap that to battle of stamina. Now, you are going to get less HP, but you do get this skill duration. Now, what's nice about the skill duration is it makes our duration go from, well, it would originally be without my reactor from 20 seconds. I'll just swap the reactor so you guys can see, to 21.8 seconds. So essentially we don't have any downtime. And what that means is we can free up a slot on our reactor, and you can just throw something that's pure damage on if you want. So if you don't need all that HP, and again, this is personal preference, you can put on battle of stamina and then put on a reactor with 2 damage rolls, and you're good to go there, but you will lose some of your HP. For myself personally, I usually just take HP amplification just for that extra tankiness, because then I really don't have to worry about the last boss killing me. And again, the same flex options apply for things like singular specialist and electric specialist. For reactor, I'm not going to go over it, but I'm just using the same reactor for all 3 builds. Again, if you're using battle of stamina and say you had this reactor, you could then drop the skill duration and change that for a damage mod if you want, but you'll be losing some health as well. Now, for components, there's 2 options you can go with here. One is going to be the damage oriented one, which is where you would just throw on the Slayer set. Now you can see I have 12.5k health and 9k defense. This can be enough for invasion missions. I've done it with a lot less, but this may not be for everybody, and it can make some of the boss fights at the end more difficult depending on how many times they are throwing homing missiles at you. So I've swapped components here, and another way you can essentially build this is just as tanky as possible. Now you can see none of my components match whatsoever. That is somewhat intentional, and it is because I'm pretty much stacking as much HP as I can while maintaining a good amount of baseline defense here. So it really just depends on which way you want to build this. I like going with the defensive components because, again, I just don't have to worry about like the boss and having to reset the run or anything like that. It just makes it more comfortable, and you still clear it in gold time. So for the auxiliary power, I have a defense roll as the base, and if you actually compare this defense roll, which is about 4,700, to something like the Slayer set, it's giving you about 1,200 more defense. So that's something important to keep in mind. Again, we're getting the defense here, and then also as high of a HP roll as I could get, and then MP recovery out of combat is also nice. Now for the sensor, you're going to want an HP roll as the base, and then again max MP and MP recovery out of combat. Your sensor can be anything as long as it has that 646 HP roll, which make sure you're checking your sensors, because a lot of the set ones, even if they are HP, they have like 400 something, so it can be lower. And for memory, you're going to want to take again another HP roll here. You're going to want to get the defense roll as high as possible on this, and then MP recovery modifier again for that passive regen and the extra mana from the mobs themselves. And then for the processor, you're going to want the HP roll. 646 is the number you're looking for on all of these, and as high of a shield roll as you can possibly get. The other roll does not matter very much. I just like toxin resistance because I find myself running through those toxic pools a lot, but you could also do a shield recovery modifier or just some junk. It doesn't really matter. And essentially the result of this is that you are very tanky in these invasions and able to run through them while one-shotting every single mob, not having to worry too much about taking too much damage and dying, and you'll be able to do the boss just fine. Even if they have that homing missile crap, you'll be tanky enough to get through it and one phase them as well. Anyways, guys, that is going to do it for this video. I hope this was informative and helps you guys out. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments of this video. I will try to answer as many as I possibly can. And thank you so much to those of you supporting me over on Patreon. I really appreciate it. It means a lot, as well as those of you supporting me over on Twitch. And of course, those of you supporting me through the Nexon Creator Program. I'm going to leave links to all of those in the description below. And lastly, if you did enjoy this video and you are not subscribed yet, please consider doing so. If not, no worries there. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will catch you in the next one.